Why are you leaving? Understandably, there can be a lot of different reasons to leave a duty in Final Fantasy XIV. Maybe you queued for a roulette and you landed in a duty you just cannot stand because you did it 3 dozen times in the past months somehow. Or you just don't like it. Maybe you have a disagreement with someone else in the group and decide the best solution is to leave. Maybe you queued mental roulette and landed in a duty that you know from experience never succeeds in random groups anyway, so you cut your losses. Or maybe something more important just came up. More important than a Final Fantasy XIV duty? I know, then it must be dire. Regardless of what the reasons may be, I have at least gotten the impression that players have gotten far more likely to leave duties on a whim since Dawntrail's release. That may just be me, but I am curious if anyone else has also noticed this tendency. Or alternatively, maybe you are one of the players that have gotten more used to leaving more aggressively recently and could give some insight into what perhaps changed. With that said, let's start with the mechanics of leaving a duty for anyone that does not know how it works. While in a duty, you can at any time open the Duty Finder menu to see the Duty menu. Here you can both review the party member portraits whenever you like, or review the description of the specific duty you are in. You can also initiate looking for replacement members, although usually when someone leaves, someone is offered this option, and usually click yes. You can also review the settings to see what the setup for the current duty is, which is typically not something that will sneak up on you. Finally, there are these two options for disengaging a duty. To leave a duty without any fear of penalty or punishment, the vote abandon option has to be used, and it only works once the duty has been going for at least 15 minutes, and requires a majority vote among all members to completely cancel the duty for everyone involved. This is helpful if the group in general agrees there is no point in continuing any further. Failing this, there's the leave option, which is exactly the topic of this video, of course. If you leave a duty in a way that incurs a penalty, you will be blocked from using the Duty Finder tool at all, even with a full pre-made group, for 30 minutes. What incurs a penalty? Being the first, this is important, to leave either at all in a matched party, meaning one where you were not a full pre-formed party beforehand, or leaving first, again, in a pre-formed party for a roulette duty within 10 minutes of initiating it. This means that if you were randomly matched with anyone at all whatsoever, leaving first will penalize you. And if you queued for a daily roulette of some kind with a pre-formed group, leaving within 10 minutes will also penalize you. On the other hand, you will not get penalized for leaving, even as the first person to do so, if you are in a fully pre-formed party, and you specifically chose the duty you wanted to do. A smaller, but notable detail to this is that if you queue for something and fail to respond to the duty pop 3 times, you also get hit with the same 30-minute penalty. This only applies if there was any random matchmaking involved, and does not apply if you had a full pre-formed party. An important thing to keep in mind is that it is only the first person to leave, period. It is not the first person to leave whenever the party is full. The fact that it is only the first person to leave that gets penalized leads to this interesting, almost reverse prisoner's dilemma, where only the first person to defect and leave gets punished, but everyone else gets off scot-free. The reason this is so interesting, at least to me, is that sometimes, like for example in an extreme duty composed of sprouts and mentors, you might have a party consisting of 4 or 5 players that actually would rather not be there. But if they leave, they get a 30-minute penalty, so instead, they stay in, hoping that it will succeed. Sometimes, these kinds of groups reach the 15-minute mark and almost immediately initiate a vote abandon, and it succeeds, because there was a majority that didn't want to be there, whether it could be done or not. Other times, what happens in these kinds of parties is one individual chooses to cut their losses immediately rather than sit through 15 minutes hoping 4 other players will agree with them on abandoning, since, remember, that isn't guaranteed anyway. However, the one individual that leaves immediately opens the floodgates for anyone else who didn't want to be there to just scoop as well. And this can also have this snowball effect where, well, we can probably replace one DPS. It shouldn't be so hard, right? To a tank and a DPS? That might be a bit. I don't mind waiting for that, I guess. To, alright, half the group's gone. This isn't happening. And then one lone sprout might finish their cutscene, entering for the first time to see an empty party. Now, that in and of itself is not really a problem. The problem is that refilling a group can be a lot harder than initially filling a group, for two main reasons. The first one being that anyone who happens to join a refilling group joins with the advantage of never being in danger of receiving penalty for leaving, so if they see that the group isn't full enough to their liking, or alternatively that the duty satisfies any one of the reasons I mentioned at the start, they can just scoop for free. The second reason is that not only is refilling groups an optional setting, it is opt-in by default. This means that of all the players in the Duty Finder, only those that consciously chose to opt into this feature will even be offered to refill a group. And while I don't have any data on this, I would go out on a limb here and suggest that there are probably less players that have turned on Join Party in Progress than have it turned off. Whether that is because they chose to, or because they don't even know the setting exists. Furthermore, I imagine this difference is even greater for things such as A Realm Reborn extremes, where the sprouts that may be queuing for them don't even know they can toggle such a thing. There's also the extra detail that Join Party in Progress only works when you are alone, which means for general content, an initial group can be composed of a bunch of pairs of players. Once it is underway, the replacements can only be solo players. And since it is an opt-in kind of thing, a mentor could, for example, queue for mentor roulette with the setting turned on, and if they happen to land in a duty in progress that they don't want, they can simply leave, opt out, and queue again and be certain that they can dodge this duty they don't want. This kind of detail that you can simply opt out like that also means that one such duty being in progress that, for whatever reason, no one wants to fill, can block off access to fill several other parties as well, since typically it is the party that has waited the longest that get the replacements first. And since they never fill, it prevents the other groups from getting replacements too. So what? Are you suggesting everyone gets penalized for leaving? No. At least not exactly. Let me explain. Sometimes, joining a party in progress places you in a lost cause that will not finish, and leaving is ultimately all you can do. Making everyone get penalized for leaving would motivate even less players to enable the Join Party in Progress option in the first place. Furthermore, the system we have in place right now, with the weird reverse prisoner's dilemma, is likely more effective sometimes than penalizing everyone. Because if no one feels compelled to leave right away, at least one pull will be attempted. And sometimes that's what it takes for the group to go, actually, I think we can do this, and stick around, or at the very least, feel invested enough in the group to help those that are there. On the other hand, if you were guaranteed punishment for leaving at any time, then there is no reverse prisoner's dilemma. And if you have any consideration towards leaving at all, you might as well cut your losses now and not later. The sooner you leave, the sooner the 30-minute penalty will be over after all. Another idea would be to reinstate the leaver penalty whenever the group refills back up to a full party. Interestingly, a considerable amount of players believe this is actually how it works. Similarly, some players don't know that leaving after the first player does mean no penalty. The problem with this solution is that it has a similar potential to have a negative effect rather than positive. If you only get penalized if you leave while the group is full, then it means we still just need the first offender to get the ball rolling. But now that the door closes if the group refills successfully, anyone with even the slightest thought of leaving will feel even more compelled to scoop immediately if someone leaves, so that they can get out the door before it closes behind them. Yes, once the group fills back up to full, there is a greater chance everyone sticks it out, since they don't want the penalty. But similarly, it will be even harder to refill the group because the quote-unquote fear of being stuck in the group once it fills compels those that appreciated the join party in progress out of being able to freely leave to leave immediately. Not a great solution either. Perhaps a bit of a sidetrack, but originally, when World of Warcraft implemented the Dungeon Finder, it similarly came with a so-called Dungeon Deserter debuff if you left first, which also lasted 30 minutes. Interestingly, it also came with a hidden dungeon cooldown that made it so that if you entered a dungeon through the Dungeon Finder, you could not use the tool again for 15 minutes. Unless, of course, you finished the dungeon. Back then, the dungeon known as the Oculus was known to be harder than average and typically also took significantly longer to finish. The long and the short of it is that the dungeon required use of the quote-unquote vehicle system and was a somewhat weird and unusual dungeon, and so, because players didn't like doing the dungeon much, most players were not very well acquainted with the dungeon, so a bit like combining Stone Vigil Heart's wacky structure with the turtle with the potential length of a near alliance raid. Hence, it was relatively common for players to straight up just leave when they saw they landed in the Oculus. But then, players discovered that getting kicked didn't incur the Dungeon Deserter debuff. Understandable, right? So what would happen is you would have party members just sit down on their bums right at the entrance and demand to be kicked as they refuse to act. This then resulted in the implementation that getting kicked as the first player also incurred the Dungeon Deserter debuff of 30 minutes. At some point, the Dungeon Deserter debuff was adjusted to only be applied if you left before at least one boss was defeated, but this is particularly interesting now, because rather recently, WoW has re-implemented that you get a Dungeon Deserter debuff anyway for leaving due to players leaving once the boss they needed loot from was down. Anyway, my point with that sidetrack was more to say that we have at least one other MMO with a similar issue and a similar solution, and it doesn't work perfectly there either. However, there is one core difference between WoW and Final Fantasy XIV in this aspect. In WoW, you cannot opt out of joining parties in progress. It is not an option. You queued for a dungeon. Here's a dungeon, so enjoy. This means that if, say, a tank leaves your group in WoW, it is usually not as much of a problem, because the next tank that qualifies for the dungeon that queues will join you. And since there is the dungeon cooldown, while there is no deserter debuff penalty for leaving this party in progress, you still have a 15-minute timer right now that is already ticking. Might as well make the most of it, right? So are you suggesting the opt-in to joining parties in progress should be removed? I don't know. I don't know if this would be better or worse. There's a benefit to being able to opt out of it at times, like if you want to experience a dungeon from the start for the first time, and there's also the key difference between WoW and Final Fantasy XIV, that WoW does not offer random groups for anything of the difficulty caliber of, say, an extreme trial. And speaking of which, some of you might have been sitting here boiling with a counterpoint of, well, Sprouts should just not queue for extremes. That's where the problem lies, right? And originally, before Dawntrail, I would probably have said yes. However, over the past weeks, while I have landed in extremes that are impossible to save, I have also been an instant replacement in a few different alliance raids, oh boy, Circus Tower, but also needed replacements in regular trials, and also been that replacement even in dungeons, like expert roulette dungeons. And while you might be leaving the duty thinking, they'll find a new tank, healer, DPS, quickly, they'll be at the front of the queue. The problem with that assumption is that they are at the front of the queue. For the players that have opted into joining parties in progress, which means sometimes it can take several minutes to replace a tank or a healer in expert roulettes. And in trials and raids, there's even more of a possibility that the replacement you do get just scoops as well. So, while I don't blame someone who leaves, they can have whatever reason they may. All I'm saying is that the first person to leave a duty opens the door for everyone else to scoop for free, which can mean that the reality is far from, they'll replace me quickly, it's probably fine. As you might unknowingly bring 3 or 4 players with you who also wanted to leave, but didn't want the penalty. Now, that is perhaps enough of me circling the same pond. However, I am very curious about this almost hurry to get on with things where players seem to be much more likely to just skip out if anything is likely to take longer than the bare minimum time. Is there a particular reason for it seemingly being more common now than before Dawntrail? Is it just me experiencing it, or are others also seeing this? Do you have any idea what causes it? And finally, before we round up completely, I feel it is only fair to say that, while there is nothing in the game stating that it is illegal to queue for extreme trials, absolutely none, for the sake of your own sanity, it may help for at least some sprouts to know that, usually, extreme content like extreme trials are typically more commonly completed through making a party through the Party Finder, not to be confused with the Duty Finder. And if you make your party through that, there's a higher probability that once you're inside, everyone's staying. Although you may need to clarify in your party if you want to do it synced and not unsynced, as players often assume old content is done this way. Additionally, free trial players cannot make parties at all, so they would have to rely on others to make their Party Finder parties this way if they so desire. Again, I'm not saying that you cannot queue for extreme trials. Go for it if you so desire. I'm simply saying that there is a greater chance the duty will end in a success if you use Party Finder instead. Depending on what data center you are on, the Novice Network might even be helpful for this too. Might be helpful. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, if you queue for a duty and see a player with an icon resembling a crown with a sword in front of it in your party, it either means they chose this icon as a PvE mentor, or they are in this duty as a result of queuing for Mentor Roulette. This means, for example, that if you queue into Ramu Extreme and see 3 sprouts, 1 with no icon and 1 with a returner icon, and 3 with a crown sword, it means the sprouts, the no icons, and the returner probably chose to be here, and the 3 crown swords rolled the dice and landed there with you. Which means, while they might be the best equipped to help you, they might also be the most likely to leave early.